Welcome to Ypres in Belgium. Now I'm standing in the Grand Place. Now at first sight, if you look round, it looks like any of these magnificent squares you find in Belgian towns representing perhaps 800 years or more of architectural history. You find squares like this in Antwerp, in Ghent, in Bruges, in Brussels itself. But this square here in Ypres is different. And the reason is this square has been lovingly rebuilt, recreated, brick by brick, stone by stone. Indeed, the whole town of Ypres has been rebuilt. And that's because this town was utterly destroyed during the 5 great battles of Ypres, which were fought round here during the First World War between 1914 and 1918. Now, of course, there were 250,000 casualties in those battles, many thousands of them coming from Yorkshire. And today we're going to try and trace where they fought, how and why they died. And our guide is Jacques Riechebosch, and the first thing I should ask you, I suppose, is why the town was rebuilt. Many wanted to leave it as a living memorial, didn't they?
Exact. The whole idea was to rebuild Ypres on another site and leave this beautiful little town as a memorial of what happened here during the First World War. One of the main reasons why Ypres was rebuilt was the population of Ypres who had fled, returned after the First World War, learned about the plans of leaving Ypres in ruins, and they said, we want our houses back, we want our churches back, we want the Cloth Hall back, we want the cathedral back. I'm saying this in a few seconds. It was not easy at all, but they did it. They did, as you said, lovingly. The beautiful thing is they even kept names of restaurants. So there are a few restaurants here on the square, and the names are just the same as they were before the First World War.
Generally speaking, how important a part did Yorkshire regiments, Yorkshire soldiers play in the battles here?
A very important part. When you look at the various battles they were in, then you realize they were in many main battles, and very important battles just to defend this little town Ypres and to prevent that the Germans would go through Ypres and to the ports of Dunkirk, Calais, Boulogne. So they played indeed a very, very important role.
We're now in the centre of Ypres. We need to go to those battlefields to see where they fought, where they died. Where are we going first?
Essex Farm, Essex Farm Cemetery, that area.
Essex Farm lies a mile to the north of Ypres. It was an advanced dressing station. This is where wounded soldiers were evacuated from the front line. If they were lucky, they would be treated and passed further back.
Well, Jacques, this is Essex Farm,
It is, yes.
And this part here was an advanced dressing station. Is the implication then that we were some way back from the front line?
From here we were about 3,000 yards behind the front lines, although the lines were converging very, very rapidly towards the canal. So during the First World War there was an evacuation system for wounded soldiers, a chain. At the front line you had what was called RAPS, Regimental Aid Post. Soldier was checked out. If it was serious, he was taken to an advanced dressing station, an ADS. And an ADS was normally situated, let's say it varied, let's say 3,000 yards, 4,000 yards behind the front line. I have to say, the ADS you see now was built late 1916. Before that, it was just a dugout in earth. And I have here a description of a soldier who gives actually a very good description about what these dugouts looked like before late 1916. It goes as follows. We took up our residence in some crazy dugouts on the Yser canal, which we crossed by a pontoon bridge. The dugouts were not even splinter-proof, mere shelters from the sun. And along the top of the bank ran a trench into which we were ordered for shelter whenever shelling started. There is plenty of water in the canal, although it is more or less stagnant. It breeds clouds of mosquitoes which bite like fun. And though it is nice to be able to get a wash when one likes, there are too many floating carcasses of various sorts.
This is something I wasn't expecting, the poem In Flanders Field by John McCraes. Now tell me a bit about him. Was he was a doctor, I think, actually, at this station.
He was a doctor, and he worked here April-May 1915 during the Second Battle of Ypres. So when John McCraes arrived here, there were dugouts, but not in concrete, in earth. And John McCraes worked here as a doctor, and on the 2nd of May 1915 he lost one of his best friends. That was Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. Alexis Helmer got hit by a shell, obviously killed, and was buried in the cemetery Essex Farm. He's now actually mentioned on the Menin Gate in Ieper. The last words in his diary of Alexis Helmer were, "It has quieted a little, and I shall try to get a good sleep." And a few hours later he was dead. John McCraes lost a very, very dear friend, and the following day, on the 3rd of May 1915, he sat here somewhere and he wrote that famous poem. The poem was published for the first time ever on the 8th of December 1915 in a British magazine called Punch. It was published anonymously, and on the 28th or 29th of December 1915, Punch magazine published all the names of the poets who had contributed to the magazine, and I have to say they made a mistake. Instead of McCraes, they printed McCree. Obviously everybody realized that it was Dr. John McCraes who had written the poem. It is very sad in a way. John McCraes did not survive the war. After the Second Battle of Ypres, he was moved to a base hospital in France, Boulogne-sur-Mer, Wimereux. Despite his high rank, he was lieutenant colonel, he kept on staying with his men, and he kept staying in tents and refused better accommodation. His whole life he had been an asthma patient, and in January 1918 he got a mix of meningitis, pneumonia, and he passed away on the 28th of January 1915.
It is still a deeply moving poem, and perhaps we should just read it through. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Are we downhearted? No, let them all come. Here we are, here we are, here we are again.
It is a moving experience to stand where the poem was written, to imagine the noise, the smell, the ravaged land, and the cries of the wounded. This is a spring day, and coaches are arriving bringing youngsters from around Europe, schools as well as uniformed groups. They are making the same pilgrimage as countless thousands of others since the war ended over 90 years ago.
Well, this is a very prominent memorial to the men of the 49th West Riding Division who died on the Salient. It's a magnificent and a very large memorial. How come that they got one and perhaps the other divisions, other battalions didn't?
Well, that regiment held the line here in 1915, 1916, and they had a very dubious honour, together with the 6th Division, to be great victims of the first German gas attacks with phosgene gas. And that was the 19th of December 1916. Also, they had a winter of 1916, and in the records you can read that there were 400 cases of severe trench foot, and it's horrible when you read it. It is written their feet were swollen like soccer balls. So not only they suffered very badly from gas attacks, phosgene gas, but also the harsh winter of 1916. So they held and defended this line, which was extremely heavily shelled by the Germans.
So obviously with this memorial there are no individual names, but presumably there are many soldiers who died from that West Yorkshire division buried down here in the cemetery.
Unfortunately there are. They are buried in plot 1 of the cemetery.
Well, perhaps we ought to go and pay our respects before we move on.
Okay.
Look along the row of graves, how young these soldiers were who gave their lives. 20, 21, 22, the youngest in the cemetery is 15 years old. Many of them died on the same day, the 4th of June 1916, when German shelling reached a new intensity to cover the retreat at the end of the First Battle of Ypres.
Now it's interesting because some of these stones have little epitaphs on the bottom and some don't. And there's a story behind that, isn't there?
There is actually. Some families did not want to have an epitaph, but the other reason is the family had to pay for those epitaphs, even per letter. Some families, unfortunately, could not afford it. So you can see some headstones without an epitaph.
That's really sad, isn't it?
It is sad, yes. Yeah.
But on the other hand, you're also telling me that until not very long ago, most of these stones were so weathered you couldn't read the inscriptions, the names at all.
That's true. About let's say 2 years ago, it was very difficult to read, and for 4 months and a half, rain or shine, the stonemasons of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission re-engraved every headstone. Normally they can re-engrave 4 or 5 headstones a day. You have to admire their work.
Now the other thing which we need to bear in mind, I suppose, is because it is so peaceful, it is so beautiful now, but when these men were first buried, they were not allowed to rest in peace even then, were they, by the Germans?
Absolutely not. And I have an account here of Harry Kendall, a soldier who was stationed here, and I think his account says it all. He writes in his diary, "Often a dozen times a day we were smothered over with mud from the graves torn up by Fritz's exhuming shells. Possibly the worst phase of this point by number 4 bridge was the eternal review of dead men before one starring ice. Slaughtered men laying about in all shapes and forms around this unholy post of ours. Sometimes these immolated human beings would be wrapped in army blankets, tied around the head and feet. At other times nothing but worse frightful disfigurements or mutilations were to be seen on the faces of the bodies of these glorious corpses."
But now at least they do rest in peace.
They do.
Let's move on now. So I think you want to show us now the Yorkshire Trench, which is at the heart of...
Take me back to dear old Ivy, but beyond the great Flanders Field.
From Essex Farm to the Yorkshire Trench is about a quarter of a mile. You cross the Yser canaal to reach it. The trench is now incongruously sited on an industrial estate, a reminder that the pressure was on to get back to normal as soon as the war ended. But a reminder also that just 21 years later, the Germans were once again advancing across this same stretch of land at the beginning of World War II.
So right here in the middle of a modern industrial estate we have the Yorkshire Trench. So presumably it was filled with Yorkshire soldiers throughout
It was 1915, 1916.
And so the first thing we come across then is this sort of wooden construction. Now, what exactly is that?
This is called actually an A-frame, which was used in the trenches, reversed A. So on the top is some kind of a duckboard where soldiers walked. Underneath was the gutter. The big problem in these areas is water. Water table is very, very, very high. What was always a problem, mud, trench foot, etc.
So as soon as you dug down to dug your trench, I mean, you hit water?
You hit water. Nowadays when they found trenches, tunnels, dugouts, always they found water pumps and water pipes, always.
So did the A-frames work? I mean, by and large, did they keep the duckboards and therefore the soldiers out of the water?
They were a great improvement. But when you look at photographs and some periods, it could be extremely wet. But definitely it was an improvement. Also it gave support to the trench.
Keep the walls apart, stop them caving in.
That's right, yeah.
Well, let's move down now actually into the trench then, shall we?
Another little drink wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink, another little drink, another little drink wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink, another little drink, another little drink wouldn't do us any harm.
I suppose obviously to give permanence, these are not sandbags, they're actually concrete blocks, aren't they?
Right,
they're made to look like sandbags, so presumably that's the only bit down here which is not authentic, is that right?
That is correct, yeah. But here we have a dugout. So for protection, soldiers have to go underground. Heavy caliber shell and clay could go down up to 30 feet.
Yeah.
So some dugouts were, let's say, 47 feet, 50 feet, even deeper.
And so down there, though, there have been little dugout areas for living and sleeping.
A little chamber there. It could be a little headquarters, place for the commanding officer in this trench. And larger dugouts behind the front lines. You have sleeping bunks, etc. Soldiers could stay. Had to go underground because we were very, very close to the enemy lines, to the German lines here.
So, I mean, how long would a soldier have been in a trench? And
in theory, there was a rotation. In theory, it could be 5 days. There are several lines of trenches. It was a rotation, 5 days. Of course, after a while, they needed to be deliced. They had to have new uniforms. In winter, it was very damp, very wet, so they needed new equipment, actually. a veteran once said, he said it with one line about trench warfare: we lived like rats and we smelled like pigs. My granddad, the only thing he said about the war was, the best remedy against lice, well, that is a good cigar. That's all he said about the war, all he said about trench warfare.
But the other thing, of course, if they were down here, presumably there was that constant fear, anticipation, dread that the order would come to go over the top into the sights of the enemy machine guns.
That is one aspect, but also trench life could be very boring. But always you had that danger of sniping, shelling, so you never knew what was coming towards you. Veterans told me during the day he kept your head down and he tried to sleep standing. So all the work happened during the night. So trenches were looked after every night. A good trench was a matter of life and death. Trench raids happened during the night. Everything happened during the night. So during the day it could be very, 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 very quiet. Yeah.
Because you couldn't do anything because you'd attract enemy fire if you did.
Exactly. So trench warfare, sniping, shelling, trench raids, etc.
And this was always, was it then, manned by members of Yorkshire battalions, Yorkshire regiments?
1915, 1916, this was their sector here. Yeah. Of course, this is only a little stretch of trenches. The trenches went much further. But as I said, the no man's land was extremely narrow.
I was going to say, how far away were the German lines?
From here, well, a little bit further was only 18 yards.
18
yards.
Barely a dozen paces.
Yeah.
You could almost hear them talk then, couldn't you? On the
anyway, yes. A little bit further, there was actually, here's Yorkshire Trench, but a little bit further was a trench, and they called it International Trench, because the nationality of that trench changed all the time.
So sometimes it was German, sometimes it was the Brits.
Yeah. There was heavy fighting here. It was certainly not as well. You could not talk about a safe sector in the Ypres Salient, but this was not a safe place to be. That's for sure.
From the dugout, a little further along, you come to a fire step. Nothing more than a plate of iron with a hole through which you could pass the muzzle of a gun. Jacques points out how dangerous the position was. The German guns would be aimed at this corner, and just putting your head above the parapet would be enough to seal your fate. The trench is unbelievably narrow. Just around the corner, another small cut into the trench. According to Jacques, this was a pas de deux, not a ballet dance, just a passing place. All the supplies were brought up along this narrow slit that zigzagged all over the place. Today, none of the mud and broken duckboards and other detritus of war would have made this virtually impassable. I asked Jacques how far away the front line would be. The answer, 100 yards. It means you would be able to hear the Germans talking. If the wind was in the right direction, smell their cooking. If you could, above the stench of the battlefield. There was little movement during the day. Most of the action took place at night or in the early hours of the morning. This whole area, indeed this trench, was fought over again and again, passing from one side to the other almost continuously from October 1914 until November 1917. From here we head 3 miles to the southeast of Ypres to Hill 60. Not a real hill, but created from the spoil of the rail line from Comines to Ypres when it was built in the 1860s.
Well, Jacques, I think now we're about 3 miles southeast of Ypres and the Yorkshire Trench where we were before, and we've come to perhaps one of the most notorious spots in the Ypres Salient, Hill 60.
Absolutely.
And this had Yorkshire involvement as well. Tell me a bit about Hill 60.
Hill 60 is a graveyard. There was continuous fighting for that hill, 60 meters high, 60 meters above sea level. Strategically a very important place, so obviously a German target. The French had it in 1914, the Germans took it, then the British took it, the Germans took it again, Then it remained in German hands for about 2 years. Then Battle of Messines, 7th of June. This was the most northern part of that battle. So the Allies took it again. The Germans took it again in April 1918, and then eventually it was taken again by the Allies at the end of the war.
So at what stage then was the Yorkshire Regiment, the Duke of Wellington's involved?
April 1915. There was an attack on the hill. It was quite successful, especially the 2nd Battalion of the Duke of Wellington Regiment fought here very bravely. They were very much involved in it. It was very harsh fighting on a very narrow frontage. Lost a lot of soldiers, a lot of officers and men, but they did the job.
But I mean, the whole war was so ghastly, it's perhaps surprising that something should be even particularly horrible here.
Yes, there was a lot of hand-to-hand fighting, there was continuous tunneling, there was continuous mining, gas was used. Hill 60, as you said, was absolutely notorious, very, very, very dangerous to be here.
Now the other thing which you mentioned, of course, which is interesting, is tunnelling, and this is where both sides attempted to tunnel under the trenches of the other side and detonate mines and blow them up from underneath.
They did, especially here at Hill 60. So you had a fortification or a position, as you said, dug a tunnel. There was a chamber under that position, put it full with gun cotton or ammonal, and they blew it up. So also mentally for the soldiers, they must have realized there is always that possibility that underneath me there's mining going on. Hill 60 was a place to avoid if you could. Definitely.
But the Duke of Wellington's, those Yorkshire soldiers couldn't avoid it. So
no.
What do we see here? I mean, it's dips and ravines and paths and craters.
A lot of shell craters, mine craters. As I said, it was continuous shelling, mining, and it's still visible to this day. It is an artificial hill, but it is absolutely a war memorial here, the whole hill.
But were those Yorkshire soldiers, the Duke of Wellington's, were they in trenches here, or was trench warfare not applicable in an area like this?
There were trenches here, but they really charged German positions here, and they attacked it successfully for a short period, because on the 5th of May 1915 the Germans launched quite a great gas attack, and that enabled the Germans to take their positions again.
But I suppose what is sense is so tragic looking back with the virtue of hindsight is that all that killing, all that fighting, and this is an area which just changed hands regularly throughout the war. Nobody really had an advantage.
That's it, all for 60 metres. Yeah. But as you can see, the view you have on Ieper is very important, strategically very, very important.
From Hill 60 we head back north again to Tyne Cot Cemetery, 6 miles to the north of Ypres. We're heading for Zonnebecker. This was where the 3rd Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele as it's better known, was fought. Jack shows me a photograph of Zonnebecker taken in 1917 that shows it completely decimated. The cemetery lies on the ridge between the small town and the village of Passchendaele itself.
This is Tyne Cot Cemetery. It's the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the world. 12,000 people are buried here. But that's really only a small minority of the total number who died on both sides in the various battles around Ypres. 500,000 people killed, missing or wounded. And what were they fighting for? A piece of land round the town of Ypres, 4 miles by 4 miles, 16 square miles in all. Well, Jacques, of those 500,000, it's not really possible to say, is it, how many actually were Yorkshire soldiers?
No, it's very difficult to say, actually. Very difficult, because they were in all theatres, all over the Salient, other places in France, name it. Very difficult to say indeed. Yeah.
And presumably also because all regiments, all detachments, battalions got decimated, and they were tacked together, were they to make up numbers?
That's right, absolutely. Certain various divisions also, true.
But all one can say is that those soldiers from Yorkshire, whichever battalion, division, company they ended up fighting for, they played a very vital role here, didn't they?
They did indeed, absolutely. Nobody can deny that, absolutely not.
But yet, on the other hand, 16 square miles is what they were fighting for. How can one possibly say it was worth it?
Well, they defended the Ypres Salient, and Ieper, the town of Ypres, became a symbol of their tenacity. And they paid a very, very high price for not allowing the Germans not to take Ypres. They paid a very high price for it, but they were one of the many who prevented it. Yeah.
But perhaps after all, above all, if you take a step back, it is just the folly of war, the cruelty of war, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Jack, thank you very much for all your time.
The graves, row upon row, the seemingly endless roll call of names on the panels, all making up the almost incalculable toll of the so-called war to end all wars. Back in Ypres, there is a British church with more memorials to the Yorkshire regiments.
Just off the main square in Ypres, you come across this church. It's perhaps rather unassuming by comparison with some of the grand Gothic buildings elsewhere in the city, but this is a very important place. It's St George's Memorial Church. It was built after the First World War, and it's a living memorial to all those who died, including those hundreds of thousands from Yorkshire. Well, I'm joined here by Canon Ray Jones, who's the chaplain. Just tell me a little about the history of this church. How long has it been here?
Well, they started to raise funds in the mid-1920s, and by 1927 they had enough money to start the building. They bought the plot of land, or the plot of land was both bought and given by local people in the Royal British Legion, one to others. And by 1929, the building, designed by Sir Reginald Blomfield, was completed and opened in July of 1929.
So its main function is what? Is to provide a permanent memorial to those regiments, battalions, companies, and of course the men in them who died here.
Indeed, yes, from First World War. And of course now we do intend to include some Second World War people who served in this area, and before the capitulation, as it were, of the Belgians. And of course schools come now to remember their pupils who were killed in the First World War particularly.
And you get a regular stream of visitors, do you, from existing regiments in the British Army?
Yes, we do. We've always had parties either of retired officers and soldiers in their regimental associations, or sometimes we have young soldiers just ending their training before they go to Afghanistan or something like that. And they come here to see how the battlefields were used in the First World War. And I think it gives them a great advantage knowing that the conditions they may face in Afghanistan or wherever are very similar to those faced by the First World War soldiers.
There is now, I think, only one survivor left from the First World War. The First World War, I suppose, is about, therefore, to pass into history as opposed to being in living memory. Do you find, though, that the interest and the commitment to the memory of those who died is getting stronger? It
is getting stronger. We're getting more and more people through. 9 years ago, we would have quite a small number of visitors over the year, but now we get, what should we say, 150,000, probably more overall, and of those 45 to 50,000 will be school students.
What is their attitude to it? I mean, do they regard it as history, or do you sense that they are getting or feeling an emotional response to the scale of the slaughter that took place around this town?
Well, I think first of all, when they come to see the battlefields, the first thing is it's just another history lesson. And by the time they come into Ypres, probably 2 days later, after perhaps they've been to the Somme and all around the Ypres Salient, they've seen the headstones with ages of soldiers who are about their age too. They've seen the enormous numbers involved. And by the time they get to the Menin Gate and the ceremony of the last post, their attitude has completely changed in most cases, and I find that they are prepared to write prose and poetry. Some schools do a performance of prose, poetry and music when they return to their schools to illustrate what they've learnt. Recently, a soldier stopped me at the Menin Gate a few weeks ago and said, "Padre, I've seen all the memorials, I've seen all these gravestones, and I wonder, will they remember us if we don't come back from Afghanistan in the same way?" Now that's a good thinking soldier, but I wonder who's going to answer the question clearly for them.
I was going to ask you, and finally, as well as being, in a sense, the custodian, you're also a priest.
Indeed.
And Do you find that people want to talk to you
Oh, very
about
much so.
the spiritual side of all this?
Yes, very much so, yes. Either sometimes in here, sometimes out on the battlefield. Sometimes I find myself being asked to go out to say prayers with a family, and then we're stopped by people asking more questions. And the burials of World War I soldiers' remains, which still go on, month after month quite often, they too are a very emotional time for people. And I must say, I find that emotion hits me too.
Canon Jones, thank you very much.
After spending the day touring the battlefields, many visitors head back into Ypres at night to the Menin Gate. It's a huge archway that leads from Ypres to the small town of Menin, built as a memorial to all those soldiers who have no known grave.
Here on the walls of the Menin Gate are recorded the names of 56,000 Allied soldiers from all over the world who have no known grave. And every night, members of the local fire brigade come here to sound the last post in their memory. It's a tradition which has gone on unbroken since 1929, apart from the period of the German occupation during the Second World War. It is an unbelievably moving experience just to be here with the crowds who gather every night. All around the walls of the Menin Gate you find panels dedicated to the memory of soldiers who served, fought and died in Yorkshire regiments. For example, this wall here is dedicated to those who served in the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. And when you just look down, the list of the names seems almost endless. Every one, somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's brother. They're grouped according to ranks. So at the top you see the captains, then the lieutenants, the second lieutenants, 2 company sergeant majors, lance sergeants, sergeants, corporals, and then the panels devoted to the private soldiers. These are all people who fell in the service of their country, in the service of their county, I suppose, who have no known grave.